thank you so much for having me back at the library. And it's a timely subject. Congratulations to you, Lisa, and your staff for, I don't know how you figured this would be the day that the trillions of dollars would finally be coming forth and we'd have something real to talk about. I'm going to ask our panel tonight, as we move through this quickly, because you can imagine the subject matter of infrastructure being so unwieldy that we're going to move at a clipped pace to try to get as many questions in as we can. And a reminder to all of you listening that if you're on Zoom, go to the chat box and send in a question often. We'd love to hear from you. And as far as Facebook, the comment section there, you can enter a question there. I mean, this is a participation, this is a conversation. So I hope you all join us on that. Without any further ado, we'll get right into the panel, and then we'll talk about the first question up, which is, I want to know from them their view of America's infrastructure so you understand the lens that they see this through. First is Maria Lehman. Maria is the treasurer right now for the American Society of Civil Engineers. They are the publisher of the report card. And I'm not in the American Society of Civil Engineers. I'm not a member. I've worked with them quite a bit over the years. So I can say this. I hope she's the next president. I don't know her competition, but she is a presidential candidate for ASCE. And after speaking with her, I can't imagine a better president at this time, at this critical inflection point of America's infrastructure. She comes with a world of knowledge and experience over decades. Right now, she's at GHD. She's in charge of the U.S. Infrastructure Division there. She's a director. She worked at the New York Thruway Toll Authority, the New York State Thruway Authority, the official name, as the chief operating officer. So talk about someone who understands raising funds, maintaining infrastructure, and building new. She was the project executive for the Mario Cuomo Bridge, AKA the Tappan Zee Bridge. And as the executive director, she was often in constant contact with the governor at the time, who pushed this project through. And finally, has served as the commissioner of public works and the chief engineer in Erie, as in Erie Canal, Erie, Pennsylvania, or Erie, New York. So there's two bookends to this as far as associations go, non-governmental organizations. The American Public Works Association is joining us as well. And Mary Joyce Ivers joins us as the president of the American Public Works Association, APWA. And they are like the yin and yang, ASCE and APWA for infrastructure. APWA designs, but they more than design, they own. They build, but they own, they maintain, they operate America's infrastructure. So you can imagine all 17 categories that the American Society of Civil Engineers has laid out is underneath Mary Joyce Ivers and her 30,000 members' responsibility. So we'll have a great way to keep the guardrails on this talk tonight with ASCE and APWA on either side. And joining us from, I believe, Connecticut is Ken Gillingham. He's an associate professor at Yale University. He specializes and focuses at Yale on climate and policy around climate, as well as new energy technologies, which you can imagine with this initiative, front page of the New York Times today, about Biden's initiative about meeting climate goals. And it's going to be exciting because not only that, I think Ken brings a remarkable experience tonight to this conversation, which is going to be largely driven by the mega legislation that President Biden is proposing for infrastructure infusion, $2.5 trillion roughly. We'll see where that goes. But Ken is uniquely positioned. He was the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He was at the White House Council of Economic Advisors as the senior economist on climate and energy. And for those of you who don't know, this group is a group of 30 people who are behind glass. The president can break that glass and get an answer on economic issues on almost any category you can dream up of. But Ken was the senior economist there, working for then President Obama, and now with his insights on that administration, I'll be curious to see where he thinks things are going to go with President Biden. And then finally, Aaron Attebery. Aaron is with Black & Veatch. It's a remarkable organization inside of Kansas City where the library sits, also in Kansas City. Black & Veatch is an employee-owned engineering and construction consultancy. And Aaron brings some great, exciting technology backgrounds. He's known for microgrids. He's a subject matter expert on microgrids. He's been working with DOTs, laying fiber to helping them understand their intra-connections, their intranet. And before all of this, he worked with John Deere, souping up tractor engines for marine use. And he says now that looks like such old technology. I think he compared it to the steam engine, fossil fuels. So we'll see where that goes. But I'm also going to be drilling down with Aaron on broadband, because Aaron specializes in broadband, and it's community-based broadband that he focuses on. So I'm really interested to talk to him about that and get your questions going on those subject matters. So let's launch right into this. I'd like to ask each panelist to describe to us what they think, what they see infrastructure as, so that we understand their perspective. Could you start us off, Maria, with that discussion? And just how do you see infrastructure as a professional at APW, at ASCE and at GHD?
Our infrastructure, I've said that what's happened in the past year with the pandemic, we've really had a good look at what happens when you have 4 crises wrapped up into one, this multiple. You've got a public health crisis that creates an economic crisis that then shows up with an equity crisis. And at the same time, you've got infrastructure issues. So you're at a pandemic, you've got to be at home, and it rains too much in Michigan and the dams fail and people have to be evacuated. You saw that with what happened in Texas. It's just this, our system of systems is old, and it's only as good as its weakest link. And we're seeing this, it's not at a midlife crisis now, it's at an old age crisis. And so we're seeing what happens when you don't keep everything up over a period of time. We did increase the GPA from a D+ to a C- on the report card. Nothing anyone should be proud about, going from a D+ to a C-, because there have been some areas where there has been some significant investment and things have gone up. And, you don't want the message to be no matter how much money you put in, it's not going to improve. But it is really time to double down and invest on some of our assets that were built for 20 and 30-year lifespans, and they're at 50, 60, 80 years old right now. And everything's coming due at once.
Maria, could you explain real quickly, though, about where the report card came from? It's beginning with the Fragile Foundations Report 1988 for President Reagan, and how it became the ASCE report card.
So President Reagan started this because, if the only way you manage something is if you can measure it, and there was no real way to measure kind of comprehensively. ASCE wanted to get together with some more other organizations and take it on. No one else wanted to take it on because they both basically felt it was an indictment of the engineering community for not getting more done. And so ASCE went it alone, and in 1998 did our first report card, which was, it was difficult because we did have to go it alone, but we felt that it was already at a point that we really needed to get the word out. We thought as kind of, the broad-based engineering that, we hit all of that infrastructure that was really important to take on. And over time, we now have a coalition of partners that help us with various reports and help, on the publicity and getting information and getting access. So now it is definitely an industry-wide operation. But I think some of the things that we've done from day one, what the grades mean, what are the public sources that we use, and every year we've added 1 or 2. This past year we added stormwater. That was included kind of with sanitary before, and there was an outcry for stormwater. We also added broadband this year. We didn't have broadband before, but we didn't grade broadband because broadband's difficult because it's a private asset. And so those are trade secrets. Those private companies don't want to talk about where they are and where they're not. And some of the things we saw, there's up to 40% of the US doesn't have the broadband that it needs. So it's an evolving process, and every time I think we get a little better at doing it. But it basically takes about 40 engineers, experts in all the different areas, about 2 years, and then we arm wrestle it out at the end to come up with the scores.
Mary Joyce, you are in charge of American Public Works Association, which is entirely different than the American Society of Civil Engineers, but you work in tandem, you said, with ASCE. Could you explain your view of America's infrastructure from that vantage point, from the presidency of the APWA organization?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Maria, for leading us off on infrastructure. American Public Works Association, we are there, as Dan said, to design, build, maintain, and operate America's infrastructure. Our infrastructure is what is the foundation for our communities and how we all love living and working where we are. It's real critical that we maintain it so it's safe. It's very important for our economics that we have safe, reliable transportation systems, that we have safe drinking water, that we are good stewards of our environment. Stormwater is very important now, and that as well as broadband's another infrastructure that's new, coming with new technologies for communication, for responders, emergency response. I think it's just everything we live around, and with the APWA that we're involved with the 8 specialties such as fleet facilities, engineering, environmental, water, wastewater expertise. So we're all working together to build these great infrastructure systems that we can construct. And then I agree, we have to reinvest in our infrastructure system because, yes, I agree with the ASCE grade point. It's great that we moved up, but we do have a lot more that we need to be planning to maintain. Infrastructure is the investment by all our community taxpayers and citizens, and we need to show the value of that to them. And that's why it's so important that we get the funding we need to help maintain it and preserve it.
I think it's fascinating that the public works people put together this Fragile Foundation report back in 1988. And I think that title is appropriate, Fragile Foundations, because it seems like infrastructure supports every social cause, every university, hospital, school. Ken, speaking of ivory towers and the White House, the White Tower and the White House, tell us your vantage point and how your lens on infrastructure.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this excellent panel. So I see us poised for massive infrastructure investments over the next decade. And I see it, there's no question that we need to rebuild our roads and bridges, but we're also in the early stages of what I believe is a major energy transition occurring. And I think this transition towards cleaner energy is going to entail massive investments by both private and public sectors. And this question of infrastructure also, the reason why I think that we're poised for such massive infrastructure investments is that it's a bipartisan issue. It's been hard to move forward, but I think we're at a time to start chipping away at this backlog. President Trump proposed a major infrastructure bill. We have our over $2 trillion American Jobs Plan by the Biden administration. There's differences between them for sure, but there's also a lot of overlap. But I noted before that I think it's going to be both the public sector and the private sector making these changes, because I think that as an energy transition begins occurring, there are going to be a lot of infrastructure investments being made by private sector entities looking to take advantage of new technologies and improve the emissions profiles of their own businesses.
Can you give us an example of some of those private entities? Because mostly infrastructure is public. I'm curious what your view of where private money might come into this, or private players would.
That's a great question. And I guess it depends on your definition of infrastructure. And I think it's worth bringing that up because infrastructure can be seen in a broad way. And for example, I would consider wind turbines put up as a type of infrastructure. That's some of our energy infrastructure. I would see new transmission lines for electricity as infrastructure. That's part of the backbone that provides energy to all of us. So I see many other investments that could be being made. Charging stations, a large amount of money has been spent by Volkswagen and their infrastructure, Electrify America investments from the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal that they were required to put in. That was a massive infrastructure investment, although small relative to what many people believe needs to be done to build out the charging station network. That I don't believe it can be done alone by the private sector, but I think that the private sector will be playing a role in many of these new infrastructure investments.
And Aaron, I'm coming for you now, right? So tell us your view of infrastructure, and if you could fit in some of the work that you're actually doing, that would be fascinating.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Dan, thanks for navigating us through these open waters this evening, and thanks to the wonderful library. Who's committed to bringing this wonderful science programming to all of us. Kenneth is exactly right. We take this simple 4-syllable word, infrastructure, and we pack a lot into it, and we don't talk about all of the definitions. Your view of American infrastructure varies based on what you work on day to day. If your job is to maintain bridges, you might think that our infrastructure is terrible. If your job is to build large-scale wind farms or renewable energy facilities, you might think this is really cool, and we're doing a lot of great things to advance the nation's infrastructure and the energy infrastructure. If your job is to go deploy electric vehicle charging stations, which Black & Veatch does a lot of, then you might think we're on the cutting edge of transportation transformation, right? The transformation of transportation, at least as it relates to electrical vehicles. To stick on the transportation front, what if it's something like Hyperloop? That gets really, really exciting really quickly. It's a dream, but it's also reality. It's here today because all dreams start out with an idea, and then you have to work really hard at it. So then the next part of it, which I spend a lot of time on, is broadband infrastructure. How do we connect America? And we're working on that. You could imagine the Rural Electrification Act of the early 1900s. Well, this is our era, right? It's 21st century is when we get to connect America to broadband.
Fascinating. Maria, I wonder if you could bring this back. You and I had spoken earlier, and I love the way you described how this could be our New Deal moment. This could be the national system of interstate and defense highways named after Dwight Eisenhower. Is this a pivotal inflection point for the United States?
I really think it is. I've been in the business for 40 years, and I've never seen the planets align better than they have now. It's on the national consciousness, and individuals around the country are being impacted one way or another. Aaron talked about, and Kenneth, about transmission and private investment, for example. The private sector on electric transmission, it's really nice that we're closing coal-fired plants in West Virginia, and we're replacing them with wind power and solar power in Texas and Oklahoma. If we don't get the transmission done, which private companies do, but it takes 10 years to get that permitted right now. That's a big extension cord you're going to have to run until you've got transmission in place. And so in that case, it's not a matter of funding it. It's about taking some of the regulatory barriers out so that we can reconnect where we have to reconnect. I think there's a whole lot of examples of that, but I think it's kind of gotten everybody's collective consciousness to this level that we really have to do something because individuals are feeling the impact. Part of the studies that we did running up to the report card is a whole series on the failure to act, the cost to the person or to the family if you don't do something. And the three that we upgraded for this report card was one on electric transmission, one on water, wastewater, and one on transportation. And then with the other ones that are in the 5 to 7 year range, these were older, so we needed to update it. We did an economic study and rolled everything together. And the not spending and letting that gap grow is costing an average American family $3,300 a year. Whether it's throwing out the food in your refrigerator because the grid is down and you don't have power to your house, or whether it's you hit a pothole and you've got to repair not only your tire but your axle, or the cost of goods and services going up because that just-in-time infrastructure is having supply chain issues. So again, it's this whole system, and I think people are starting to understand that, you know, I mean, it took us 9 months to figure out how to get toilet paper to people, and we were still making toilet paper, and the roads were open, and life was going on. So when you can't get basic things, it really, people start questioning what's going on here. And so I think there's a clamor. It's always been about the pay for, but I think now with some of the issues we have to face, maybe there's more political will to get that done.
I'm curious, Mary Joyce, when you're in Ventura, California, and I wish I were working for you in Ventura, California, just north of Los Angeles on the Pacific Coast Highway, you said that the Pacific Coast Highway has seen a great deal up and down it. The fires around Big Sur and around Los Angeles, the collapse of a bridge, mudslides. It's a dangerous place to live, it seems. What is it like for you? And more importantly, back to the issue of 10 years from now, how might Ventura's DPW be operating differently? Because you're in charge of that organization, you're leading it as the deputy director there.
California, like across our nation, has seen a lot of natural disasters recently. And yeah, my power's going out. No, I'm kidding. So we want to mitigate. No, it's not. We want to mitigate and be prepared for natural disasters. And so what Maria was talking about with regulations and strengthening the grid and resiliency, that's really important now in California, especially with our power company doing safety power shutoffs. And we want to be prepared for that and looking for power storage and energy storage and how we can keep our critical systems operating, as well as designing these new power grids and systems and making them more resilient so that we can mitigate any potential fires or power outages for a long time that impact our citizens. Yes, with the reinvesting in our infrastructure will save us money in the long run. I think with COVID and such, it helps us be more creative and find more exciting solutions to how we rebuild our infrastructure and looking ahead 10 years from now. With the electric vehicle infrastructure, reducing our carbon gas emissions with the goal in California by 2035. I'm working with our OEM manufacturers on vehicles and equipment. And in 10 years from now, we've got really safe, I visualize safe transportation, more, non-energy required modes of transportation, whether electric buses, trains, more active transportation modes out there. And also talking about, one more thing, talking about public versus private, we're stronger together. The public and private industries rely on each other for the creativity and finding the solutions to design, build, and maintain our infrastructure. So that's an important piece.
An excellent point. And I find it fascinating, the play of public and private, because I don't think there's a single project that's ever been done that wasn't a mixture at some level of both. But Ken, I'm curious about something. Could you tell us, look, we back out and look at a larger image of this plan, this American Jobs Plan that might be the American Jobs Act. You know, it sounds like Obama in 2011, but this is now President Biden, and he's launching this effort. What do you see coming from it that will change America's infrastructure in 10 years?
Great question. Well, you're right. It is an American Jobs Plan. There are many different actual bills in Congress that are coming out that draw upon pieces of this plan. So it is a proposal, but it's an ambitious proposal. We are talking about over $2 trillion over 8 years, with much of it up front to try and really get us out of this pandemic malaise that we're in now. But there are a whole bunch of components to this. It has everything. So there's unquestionably a piece for roads and bridges, and then that needs to be in there. I mean, it's very clear. I think the Federal Highways Administration says every dollar spent on transportation, on like road infrastructure, leads to something like $6 in GDP. Obviously, you couldn't do that forever, but there are figures out there saying that we need to make sure that these are kept up. But there's a lot in there that's leading to physical infrastructure that will lead us towards this energy transition. Some of it is more simple, like more into transit, local transit, there is some funding for high-speed rail. And I know, Dan, you worked on high-speed rail. So there's that in there. But there are some other parts to there, things like upgrading ports and improving port electrification. California, for example, has several ports that are starting to be electrified. That's infrastructure. Building out charging stations is in there. Building out the electricity transmission grid, making sure that there's energy storage. There's also some interesting parts about buildings. Upgrading homes to energy efficiency, and that's as much a jobs plan as anything. But also there's some in there on smart home infrastructure that I find quite interesting.
Okay.
And smart home infrastructure could allow homes to, say, be programmable to automatically respond. And already we heard about California's issues with the rotating blackouts. How can we prevent that from happening as we transition forward? And we know about Texas recently as well. So one of the pathways to do so is to allow there to be some demand response with smarter homes. And then finally, there's also a piece in there about investing in the research infrastructure of the country. And of course, I'm in the ivory tower, you could say. So I appreciate everything about the research infrastructure, but I do think that there are a set of technologies that still need to be developed further. Already battery storage or energy storage has been mentioned, but those costs have been dropping dramatically. If they continue dropping, that starts to become a game changer in how the infrastructure is going to be looking like in a decade.
I'd like you all to be thinking about this. We'll come back around, but thank you for that answer, Ken. That was great. About why at California High-Speed Rail, we'll just take that as a real-life example, America's most ambitious infrastructure project. I could not wait to get started working there. And after 10 years, they're 1% done, $10 billion in the hole. That will take 100 years to finish at this rate. We have to think honestly tonight about how we actually build this infrastructure in 10 years, what it's going to look like. The Second Avenue Subway, another $5 billion 10-year project to build 3 train stations. So Aaron, could we talk about trains? Could we talk about Hyperloop? Could we talk about how Black and Veatch did the first ever study on Hyperloop? And I think it was going to go between St. Louis and Kansas City with a stop in Columbus in Missouri. Not far from where you worked in a nuclear power plant, I remember. So we'll come back to that in power.
I've done too many things in my lifetime. Yeah.
And you look ancient.
Yeah, I'll take it. The Hyperloop feasibility study that Black and Veatch did in 2018 was in partnership with a handful of companies here in the Kansas City area, but it was this idea of what's the economic impact? Is it feasible to build a Hyperloop transportation system from Kansas City to St. Louis? And if you did that, you'd now take 2 populous areas that are roughly, let's just say 2 million people each, and you put them together and you connect Columbia, Missouri, where the home of Mizzou is, MU, and you now have a 5.5 million mega region where cities now become metro stops, and it can now compete with the likes of a Dallas-Fort Worth area. Is that not exciting for these, I would say, tier 2 cities that can now compete with these much larger scale cities? For sure. Is it feasible for you to take people off of the highway system, not drive cars, and put them on the Hyperloop? How much would they pay for a ticket? How much gas would we displace? Is Hyperloop technology more robust than airline transit? It is, if you look at it firsthand, it's not affected by weather. It's in a closed tube. You don't have to deal with rising and falling oil prices because it's electric. I'm going to call them autonomous. They're driverless pods, right? So now you have other interesting, you start looking at people operating operations and maintenance. Should this be a public-private partnership? Should it be public-owned? Should it be private-owned? Who gets to operate the Hyperloop system? The airlines all get to fly in the sky, so would different operators have access to Hyperloop technology? These are the questions we wrestle with in that report as we continue to advance Hyperloop technology forward. And then just recently, under U.S. Chairman Chow at the U.S. DOT, who recently stepped down, they formed the New and Emerging Transportation Technologies Council, the NET Council, and out of that, we are going to regulate Hyperloop technology under the Federal Rail Administration, the FRA. That answers a lot of questions for private companies who are developing patents. They now have a path forward to certification.
I saw the head of Missouri DOT talking about how the interstate highway system, the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, the full name, the interstate system, was launched in just outside of St. Louis on I-70, and the I-70 corridor might just be the right-of-way for Hyperloop. Sounds very, very enticing.
They don't call it the Heartland for nothing.
The Heartland, I love it. And I want to pause for just a second and ask Eric Ward from the library, Linda Hall Library, if there's any comments or anything he'd like to inject here right now from our listening audience with Facebook and Zoom technology. Moving on, though, Maria, could you talk to me about, I'm fascinated by this and would love to know your view of it, since you were the executive project director for the Mario Cuomo Bridge, not the Andrew Cuomo Bridge, but the former Tappan Zee Bridge replaced with the cable stayed bridge, beautiful structure, no mass transit on it. What is this, how did you start this project without the funding? It seems like the cart was ahead of the horse on this one, but it's remarkable, and maybe this is what we need to know so we can get something built in 10 years.
Well, what I can tell you is that the Federal Highway Administration says that the average time from the inception of a project or the notice of intent to construction completion is 15 years. That's the average. I think the difference is that when Governor Cuomo was elected, he made it his imperative that bridge needed to be replaced. The Thruway had spent $1 billion in a decade keeping that bridge open because there was issues. A lot of steel had to be replaced. The bridge had to be redecked. It had steel plates on it a lot because there was punch through. And so it was the money pit, the movie, The Money Pit, right? The house that you keep throwing money into. What was different is you had alignment between the federal government and the state government and political will. President Obama established a dashboard that he was briefed on at that time, 10 projects every week. And the governor was actively involved. Sometimes every other week there was a briefing call, sometimes every week. When an agency knows that they're being watched that closely, no one wants it sitting and stuck on their desk. And so political will, I think, and the stakeholder outreach really made a difference. That environmental impact statement, which was both under NEPA and SEQR in New York State, took 13 months. Most of them take 3, 4, 5 years. And so you did a $4 billion project, and concurrently we were doing the procurement. We had a number of financial plans in place. We got the largest TIFIA loan that was ever given at $1.6 billion from the US DOT. But at the same time, we were looking at other innovative ways of funding. We did some bond issuance, some of the issues that with the banks and the fines they paid to New York State underwrote some parts of it. So it was a funding stack, probably 20 different sources of funding, but everybody was pushing to move ahead. We didn't have design build legislation when we were doing that, and we were procuring design build. So we had to do the legislative piece at the same time to get the authority to do it, design build. But it just proves that if you have the political will, you can move literally mountains.
Well, the New York Thruway is a 700 mile or 600 mile, roughly 700 mile.
570, close.
570 mile. And I think it was billed as the largest superhighway in America before the interstate system came along and supported it. Mary Joyce, could you tell us though what your members are going to do with this? Maybe spoils of victory here. If there's lots of money coming in, it fascinates me that so much of, I think it's 90% of the funding for maintenance and operations comes from state and local government, and 65% of the capital investment comes from state and local government. What will a massive infusion of federal funds look like for your DPW members?
I think it's awesome. I think it's great that we get this funding down to the local levels, especially when we've got small communities, rural communities, that it's really challenging for them to get the money to reinvest in their communities. So that's really exciting, which will help support our commerce and our entire nation with its economics. We will be excited about it. As public works professionals, we want to do what's best for our communities, and we have the expertise and the will. The fact that it's bipartisan, it's all there to do the best for our communities and all our citizens is really important to us, as well as when referring to, what Aaron and Kenneth has said about the jobs creation. Public works is an exciting career, whether you're an engineer or a planner or you're vocational. We need all those skills to rebuild America. And so this provides a great opportunity for exciting jobs, especially with our newer people coming into the workforce who are more technically savvy. There's a lot of opportunities with technical opportunities as we rebuild.
Ken, I'm curious, with infrastructure being this issue now that struggles to be defined, infrastructure back in the late 1800s was a French term for structures below the surface for military operations. It became popular in the 1920s in civic use. And now it seems to be spreading into childcare and social programming. So could you explain to us what it looks like from you, what you think this round of infrastructure spending will look like as far as where the dollars will mostly flow?
That's a great question. I mean, I can only speculate there, but that history is fascinating. I didn't know actually that was where the name infrastructure came from. Very cool. I think I need to read your book.
Please do.
And no, so I do anticipate that the vast bulk of, or at least a very large portion, will be going to classic roads and bridges. I think that is where the bulk of the funding will go. I will note that childcare is a separate bill. That's not part of the initial, American Jobs Plan. They came out with another major proposal that's not as focused on infrastructure. It's focused on childcare and education more recently. So I actually do see those as two distinct plans, if you will, coming out of the Biden administration. But I think your question, though, is a really, really good one, though. Like, where do we draw the line on infrastructure? And I like to see infrastructure as physical infrastructure that provides services to our communities. That to me is just crucial to the idea of infrastructure, which to me does go beyond roads and bridges, but childcare is not a physical infrastructure. It has
it is fascinating, Ken.
Something. Yes.
Excuse me. It is fascinating, Ken, how, and I just want to see what you think of this, but socially, I mean, it's social equity. If nothing from the plague comes to light, it's the inequities, social equity, it's climate, it's economics, and infrastructure is all of that. And so I love the messy complexity and the inability really to define it. Is Biden tying all this together? Because that will be impactful for our next 10 years if he's successfully tying climate and social equity with economic prosperity.
I think the vision, so this is based on my conversation with folks that are currently in the White House, but I think the vision is that they want to build both social, physical, and educational capital in the country. And they see the infrastructure that we think of as physical infrastructure as one component of it. They see improving the education system as another component, and they see childcare as another kind of component of it. That's the vision. There are many challenges in thinking about how to actually make sure the money is well spent, for sure. But that's the vision and I think the conceptual way that you tie them together.
Aaron, talk to us about, and speaking of COVID, how we maintained our economy. If this crisis, this plague had struck us in the 1980s, I don't think we would be here talking. I think there would be a great depression, a great recession, maybe both. But tell us about what you think, because I know one of your specialties is community-owned broadband. So could you just touch very quickly on what broadband is and extrapolate into what community-owned broadband is?
Yeah, for sure. In 2 minutes, is that where we're now?
No, 30 seconds.
Now, Kenneth was hitting on, we kind of wrestle with what's the unseen infrastructure? What's not the hard services? And I work in this data communications and technology and data centers. And that's where we push hard infrastructure to like virtual infrastructure. And when you start thinking about how do I have access to healthcare, or how do I have access to finding childcare? Well, where do you get your information today? You go to your device, you go to the computer, you go look it up. And if you don't have connectivity or good connectivity speeds, then you are already falling behind your peers or those across the street from you. If you don't know how to go find where that next child help, where the child care places are, you're not going to be able to find childcare unless you know somebody or you have a friend of a friend. So broadband and how COVID-19 kind of changed the way we view connectivity is it's never been more important. Connectivity has never been more important than it is today. COVID forced a lot of people to work out of their homes. There are a lot of first responders that had to work in the field, and we are eternally in their debt for all the work that they did. And then there's the others that were working from home. Those that had access to the internet were able to maintain their lifestyle. They were able to keep the economy going. A lot of people and a lot of companies weren't ready for that transition. We had to change a lot of our processes. I'm sure Mary will probably shake her head up and down. We went from paper permitting to digital permitting when we wanted to go build in the right of way. How do we change our entire economy to this digital age? So
aren't we late though, Aaron? Aren't we late to the game? I mean, China, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, the Netherlands all have almost 100% connectivity of high-speed internet with fiber optic cables going into homes. What is going on?
Yeah, the goal of this administration is to have 100% broadband coverage by 2030. Well, that's 9 years out. Now, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, under the Trump administration, created the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Let me say those words again, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This is $20 billion to be injected in to our internet service providers and our municipalities to be able to expand and grow that fiber network to reach the untouched, the underserved population, because it wasn't economically feasible to reach them before. So we need to subsidize or inject some cash to build out those networks to give them fair access as well.
So if I get this right, Verizon, Comcast, Spectrum, they would benefit in a way if this broadband was owned by the community and they could all go into these other communities that right now might be cost prohibitive for them to get into because they're so rural, so remote.
Each community owned network has to be operated by somebody, a local ISP, internet service provider. And that's going to be based on state legislation, whether municipalities are even allowed to own their own networks, or do they have to rely on competition and internet service providers to bring that to their constituents.
Maria, I'm curious, as the chief operating officer of the New York Thruway, what will the challenges be for the heads of large authorities, organizations, DOTs be in dispersing the projects and the money? Like inside the sausage factory, what does it look like when you have an infusion of federal funding for these large organizations?
Well, toll road, it's still complicated because you can't toll highways under current federal law. You can't do federal funds into toll roads unless you take the tolls off. You can do it on bridges, you can't do it on highways. So that's one of those regulatory things that has to be fixed. But if they're smart about how they do it, and I think based on a lot of things that was in the plan, and some of the documents that have come out since, I think there's been a lot of thought given to how to do it. For example, the water wastewater piece of the Jobs Act was $110 billion. And the thought process was that, like 90 to 100 billion of that was going to go into either grants, which is what the state safe drinking water revolving funds and the safe drinking water funds started off as grants, and then it became a loan system. So they're just pouring more water into a system that already, is already reaching out to all those agencies. And everybody has a list. I mean, if you're a public works director, or you're running a state DOT, or you're running a water authority, you know what your plans are for 5 to 10 years out, or if you had more money. quite frankly, if you're doing municipal bonding, you have to do that. It's part of the reviews that you do with the agencies that rate you. And when you go to market, they have to see that you have a plan, that you have sustained revenue to pick that up, and what happens down the road. So I think if there's less strings attached, I think we're up to the challenge. I think the agencies really do have, DOTs and local agencies have transportation improvement programs that go to state transportation improvement programs. But they also have long-range plans of projects on the 20-year horizon that if they had the money, they would build them. On the bridge side, the plan says the 10,000 worst bridges in the country get replaced. That's simple. Federal Highway does a printout. They flip it instead of from best to worst to best. You draw a line at 10,000 and you send the money out. It's not that difficult.
None of those bridges are on the New York Thruway, I'm sure. Mary Joyce, could you tell us, though, what, from your perspective, is going to be, what do DOT, well, I wouldn't say DOTs, but DPWs, when they're faced with this kind of a challenge, where do you see them struggling the most? I mean, in an honest moment, what would you say your members are most challenged by when it comes to rolling out ambitious plans? Like you're a $300 million budget in Ventura, California, if I remember. And you talked about, a $3 million grant is wonderful, but when the bridge costs $300 million, what do you do?
Right. And Maria talked about this before. It's the regulations and we want to do the right thing. We want to protect our environment. We want to build it to the proper safe codes. But it gets challenging sometimes when we have competing regulatory agencies or it's just delayed. Maria, that's impressive. You got through NEPA and CEQA in 18 months for the bridge. We have we are on the Pacific Ocean and we have two bridges that cross two natural rivers. So we could be in an emergency, we could have some major challenges, and that's something that concerns us. And we really have been prioritizing this and doing our evaluations, and glad we did get grants on the one bridge. But it's over 60, 70 years old of a bridge that heads north to Santa Barbara. I do have one example today that I was questioned about. Our transportation public works departments in Southern California now are finding out that we cannot design the local streets and roadways with federal funds with the Green Book specs that we've been using for years. And so they're requiring us to use different federal requirements, which is they found on an old legislation that we're scrambling to see, well, how is that going to affect us and how do we do this? So that's another challenge of we've been designing and building roadways for a long time. We know what to do, but if they're going to put new criteria on that could cause a delay and cause more time instead of putting the time and resources in that we need to get our projects designed and built.
Eric Ward, we have a question, I understand, from a listener.
Yes, Dan. It's a question about maintenance. Joe asked, if we are able to seize this moment and build back better, how can we sustain this, convince policymakers that maintenance matters, and not let things degrade again over the next 20 to 30 years? How do we get people excited about the day-to-day work of maintaining what we have?
Wow. I'm gonna put that to Maria and to Mary Joyce. Go ahead, Maria.
First of all, if you look at life cycle costs on a project, there are things you can do that maybe are more expensive up front, but make it much easier to maintain and, not worry about the fact that you're going to have to do certain things. The Mario Cuomo Bridge was designed for 100-year design life. And when that challenge was first posed to us, we all said, well, what does that mean? And how do we do that? The intent is not to go back to have to do major work on the piers and on the structure for 100 years. And so there was money invested up front that kind of makes it much easier over the lifespan. And now that we're doing things with BIM, with building information models, Those models and that information can tell you exactly if the lifespan of an LED bulb that's lighting up some piece of that bridge is this long. It will spit out how many light bulbs you have to buy in any given year. It's going to make it pretty simple for you to understand what the ongoing commitment is. We haven't had systems like that in the past, and so you will have that list of what you need to do. I think we right now are thinking the Tappan Zee was built light and fast and cheap. It was right after the Korean War. There were steel shortages, and there was a real need for a bridge. And so we didn't go to what we did when we built like the Brooklyn Bridge. When in doubt, make it stout, right? We got really skimpy on how we built it, and that's why it lived its 50 years, and that's it. And then it was ready to go. So if we think about that life cycle as we're rebuilding with this money, I think we can get, instead of 20 to 30 years, we can get 50 to 100 much easier than we did before.
Mary Joyce, you're shaking your head. I see you agreeing with Maria.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question on maintenance. I'm very passionate about maintenance and operations and what we do. We want to protect the investment of our taxpayer and public dollars. And it's so important that we have great asset management systems. Our neighbors in North America and Canada, they have to have a very strong, robust asset management system to even receive their federal dollars for their infrastructure. And that's something that we are working on within Public Works and with our agencies. And the other thing that's really important is we really need strong predictive maintenance plans and systems put in place so we can maintain this infrastructure and keep it safe and resilient, reliable. And the other piece to that is ongoing funding. What that looks like in transportation in the future with electric vehicles or the Hyperloop is vehicle miles traveled, really looking at what should that federal tax look like so that we can continue to reinvest. You want to reinvest before you have a failure. We're at the point of the C- to D failures. It is going to cost us more. Similar to how you do a slurry cover on your street to extend its life. You invest when the street's just a couple of years old to extend its life instead of waiting till it crumbles and you have to rebuild it. So, maintenance is very important.
Well, I think
and it should be in the plan with life cycle costing.
And I think we saw the dramatic example of that in 2007 on August 1st when the Minneapolis I-35W bridge collapsed. And it really struck me then, for someone watching these things, that infrastructure is everything. It's all interconnected. And this bridge was carrying a school bus. Schools are part of the infrastructure categories. Water, communication lines. It fell into the Mississippi River on top of lock number 1 for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And it stopped river traffic, and it goes on, and how critical that infrastructure is. That bridge was being maintained when it collapsed. Part of the collapse was attributed to all the maintenance crews and equipment and materials on the bridge. I'm going to turn this to energy right now. Aaron and Ken, you both are focused on energy in your work. Ken, could you talk to us about the bigger picture? And then Aaron, if you'll follow up with specific about what your focus is when it comes to energy.
Sure. I can talk about the bigger picture in terms of how the energy transition is going to be really affecting the infrastructure that's needed. So we just saw today a plan to go. The Biden administration wants the U.S. to drop from 2005 levels by 2005 levels of emissions by 50% by 2030. That's pretty ambitious. It's most climate scientists say it's still not sufficient for climate change alone, and it's not as ambitious as some of the things that Europe is doing, but it's more ambitious than anything that the U.S. as a whole has proposed. How do you get there? It actually does require a lot of infrastructure, and there's some really interesting pathways by which it requires. We already talked about transmission lines and building out renewables. I talked a little bit about energy storage. There are also some really interesting parts of infrastructure that are worth bringing up. If we really want to decarbonize our economy entirely, we not only have to convert a set of infrastructure that's existing natural gas pipelines, for example, that's used for fossil fuels, to other fuels, some of which may be stranded, but we have to convert a whole other set of processes and build the infrastructure to handle new fuels. So an example would be hydrogen. People are talking about using green hydrogen, which would be hydrogen produced using renewables, so excess renewables, electricity, and using that for a whole set of industrial processes. You could use it for steel making. You can use it for a whole set of chemical processes. You can use it for cement manufacturing. So in a whole set of those areas, companies are already beginning to explore these. They have pilot projects. They're really moving forward, in some places pushed by other jurisdictions, other countries, actually, Europe in particular. And if we switch to having to have a hydrogen infrastructure, this would be a whole set of pipelines. It might be a conversion of our natural gas pipelines. It might be new pipelines. It would be building the facilities that creates hydrogen. Hydrogen can also be used for electricity generation as well, for those, if there's a season or a long period of time where the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. Batteries, you may have so much capacity, you may want to hold something on the back. Hydrogen could be used for that as well. And actually run with some modifications in current natural gas plants. These are all infrastructure investments that are pretty interesting when you think about the pathways that people are now exploring for how a deeper decarbonization might occur.
Aaron?
You want this one in 25 seconds?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I used to work at a nuclear power plant facility. That was where one of my first jobs in college and then right out of college. And I learned a ton about the grid and nuclear power and the sheer amount of energy that can be created on a very small footprint and how safe it is. So I personally am a big champion of nuclear power. The power plant I worked at was Callaway Nuclear Power Plant Facility in Central Missouri. It was built in 1985. All the spent nuclear fuel that's ever been used is still stored on site in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That was it's still operating today. It's an amazing facility and pumps out 1,200 megawatts consistently. It's base loaded. It runs all the time. And then you get to shift into new technologies, renewable energy, wind, pumped hydro, and these ways that we can kind of try to offset or balance our carbon footprint, where we transition from coal burning to natural gas burning power plants. And then I go a little bit further into transportation, electric vehicles, taking off some of the gasoline vehicles we think of our own, but don't forget about medium duty and heavy duty trucks, buses, transitioning those into EV charging stations. And then take it a little more personal. We mentioned smart home at the beginning. Can you envision in 20 years that every home that's built is built with an air conditioner and a heater, but it also has a bank of batteries in the basement? And it also comes with an EV charger in the garage. That's just standard equipment. And then now each one of those homes is like those little AA batteries that's in that bank on that EV car. And each one of those homes can be turned on and off on the grid through demand response, pumping power in and out as we deal with that. Our infrastructure is not set up to handle two-way power flows. If we put a lineman on the electrical grid, they know that power comes from the left and it goes to the right. If I shut it off here, I'm safe. But now if you have the ability to pump power back on the grid from your home, there's a lot of different infrastructure that needs to be put in place in order to keep our maintenance professionals safe.
And I would say first responders. Mary Joyce, you talk about departments of public works being part of the triage of first responders with fire and police. You can't get to a fire without someone from DPW clearing the way, especially in California when there's mudslides. What is your concern, though, for fleet vehicles? And can that be transitioned, your fleet vehicle maintenance, which you are a champion of, and couldn't there be lessons in that for private vehicles that Aaron's talking about?
Yes, we've had electric vehicle charging stations and electric vehicles for 20 years. They work really well. The batteries will last a long time. It does take our fleet technicians different training to learn how to work on them, as well as we had a partnership with our fire department. Our fire department came down to our fleet facility and looked at our vehicles so that they could learn if they ever had to extricate out of an electric vehicle. So it's great to be prepared to know how best, if you have to do a first response with one of those vehicles. And yes, we are looking forward to the medium duty and heavy duty electric vehicle coming from the OEMs. I did see a fire truck made in Germany. It's pretty cool to see. So the technology is getting better and coming out in the near future so we can meet those low emission goals.
That's excellent. I'm curious, Maria, what do you think of when you think of rolling out these charging stations, which are needed? About 2.5% of vehicles, 2.5 to 5% of vehicles on the road today are electric. If we start to ramp up quickly to meet those emissions goals that Ken was talking about, what do we do? How does that look for the everyday driver? Who, I think, Aaron, I'm quoting you when you talk about range anxiety. If you need those charging stations to get out and about. I have range anxiety in a 1949 Hudson that I drive around, but that's another story.
Well, I think the issue is that when we started with EVs, you couldn't go very far. I know when I was at the Thruway, we actually put high-speed charging where you could get a full charge in 30 minutes through a number of our rest areas that around the major cities. Because we figured no one in an EV is going to go the whole length of the Thruway just because they're going to have to stop several times because of the ranges. But as storage technology gets better and the batteries get better, you're going to have better ranges. There's already a lot of discussion on buses and fire trucks and heavy trucks. But, I mentioned the system of systems before. So we have all these roads and all these bridges in tough condition. Those are going to be much heavier vehicles. I have a hybrid, so I have a Malibu Echo that has a battery in it as well as gas powered, and so it uses all the braking energy and all that energy to charge up the battery. And there's times it runs on batteries, times so I get great gas mileage, but it's heavier. Like 15% heavier than a regular Malibu. You're looking at these trucks, they're going to be much heavier. Heavier on bad roads and bad bridges accelerates deterioration. So again, you have to think about this systemically, because the amount you're going to have to invest in the highway and bridge system to be able to take on all these new vehicles has to be cooked in, and it's not right now. I mean, that's just being looked at of what the new loading is going to look like for design standards. Mary Jo talked about that. The design standards don't necessarily match up with what we're seeing, and how do we prognosticate what that is 10 years from now?
Ken, I'm curious, when I look at electric vehicles, I think great promise, but I think it's still kicking the can down the road, because if you look at the math, you can't possibly get as many people to and from a spot if everyone's driving around in a nice Tesla. It's going to take up a lot of space. It's going to take a lot of carbon to make those Teslas, the batteries, everything. So what gives on the policy? What will be some of the mechanisms to drive some of these faster trains or high-speed trains in theory, or maybe even just really great subway systems in the secondary and tertiary cities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think all of the transit agencies, all of the agencies that are working in this area claim they need more resources. You have had an experience where you argue that resources alone may not be everything. You may need more than just resources. You may need to expedite permitting. You may need some other aspects that need to be done, which may be very hard to do due to the federalist system that we have in this nation. So I think investment's one key aspect there. I'm more optimistic that we will soon be at a point with battery technology being inexpensive enough that by 2030, it's going to be normal to be driving an electric vehicle. GM says they're going to be selling all electric vehicles by 2030. Volvo, Jaguar, well, Jaguars are kind of unusual cars. It won't just be Tesla. So Teslas, you can drive 400 miles on some of the Teslas. That's a pretty long range. So I'm actually a little more optimistic that they'll start to become the norm, and that they'll be just as cheap as we won't be talking about driving a Tesla. We'll be talking about driving just a normal car, and
Okay.
it'll be electric, and it'll charge quickly. Maybe not as quickly as filling up your gas tank, but still quite quickly, getting close to the same amount, and there'll be charging stations everywhere. I think there's a reasonable chance that's the case. But still, Dan, your point is absolutely correct that the environmental impact of a huge amount of EVs is much greater than if people were taking some of those long trips using rail, using other approaches. But I think it's a tough nut to crack. Americans love their cars.
They do.
And so I don't have the answer there, with the exception of if you can make the services as appealing as possible, the lower carbon services as appealing as possible, you may be able to make a dent.
And Aaron, you're working with DOTs a lot to run fiber optics so they can communicate with themselves to help us the driving public, move up and down the highway. How does that work? And will we see that, do you think, in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I like to talk about this as everyone understands cell phones and applications. You download an app on your phone, and eventually you download too many apps or take too many pictures, and the phone gets slow, right? This is the same type of idea in the infrastructure we see for DOTs. They have a technology that was deployed 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and there are now new applications being built on top of that. I've got now high definition cameras. I'm trying to do real-time pricing for toll roads, traffic counts. I need to be able to manipulate the flow of traffic in real time. That layer of data is now being consuming the bandwidth of these DOTs networks. And so they need to upgrade their networks. We need to go deploy fiber in the right of way to be able to improve operations and stay up with technology so that consumers like you and I, when we buy the next whiz-bang car, it has vehicle to infrastructure communications. It knows where the edge of the road is because the road's talking to it.
Fascinating. And good luck, right, Mary Joyce, when there's snow and darkness and mudslides on that road that those cars need to see. I've got Eric Ward from Linda Hall Library with another question. Eric?
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions about developing a workforce. How do we go about exciting kids about, getting kids excited about engineering and training them, developing that workforce, especially for industries, emerging industries such as clean and renewable energy?
No, that's a great question. I would love if we would just all rip around the ring here, starting with you, Maria. A quick thought on that.
One of the things that we did a few years back is we thought about that, and that, the space program created that big chunk of people going into engineering because they got all excited about the space program. I think if we have a big infrastructure package, that's going to happen. And what ASCE did is we launched Future World Vision, which is basically our best prognostication on what life will look like in 50 years, because our design lives are 50 years. And so we're actually putting some meat on the bones, and it's augmented reality. And, answering questions like, how do you get, if drones are going to get our lunches to our building, how are you going to get all those drones into a building in a 10-minute spot? So, looking at all the challenges, but as soon as you start talking about a system and the environmental piece, and it's very futuristic, we've actually launched this with a number of universities as kind of their a virtual teaching package, and it's been very successful. So I think we have to show how exciting the future really is, because we really do feel that it's exciting.
Mary Joyce?
Well, before COVID, we have National Public Works Week each year, which is the second week in May, and a lot of our agencies would have touch a truck or open houses where you could bring your kids in and they could sit on the snowplow, or they could sit on the backhoe, or see what a surveyor does, and then what the engineers do. So I think we're always doing outreach, whether at the elementary or college level, that there's many opportunities to work within a public works career. So it's exciting. Last month, I did have an opportunity to judge on the future cities of the moon, and it was 7th and 8th graders across the world. And that was pretty exciting. And they brought in the economics, the healthcare, food, transportation. And I was really, really inspired about our future with our new generation coming up with the technology. So We just have to talk about what we love doing and be passionate about it and educate.
And Mary Joyce, your work is so tactile. I'm sure that you love the children and elder possible job candidates love the big trucks and the outdoor activity that your work ensues. Ken, what do you think?
Yeah, the two answers so far have been superb.
Right?
Yes, make it exciting, allow the imagination to run wild, provide opportunities to think and reimagine how we can live in our world are ways to really engage the next generation and get them excited to go into these paths.
Aaron, how do you recruit students to go work in nuclear power plants?
I have a hard time finding a hard hat small enough. I'm being facetious, but investing in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, giving back as a professional to go give those talks to colleges, to high schoolers, to grade schoolers, being available as a corporation to your local community to kind of spur on those ideas and talks is definitely something we can all do, is to get local and get involved.
Well, we have about just 2 more minutes left, and I cannot thank you all enough. You've been an excellent panel, and it's been just a joy to hear these questions and answers go back and forth. But I want to ask a very quick round here to go out on what in 10 years from now will be gaining, which of the 18 categories of infrastructure will be the beneficiary, the greatest beneficiary, or which one will gain credibility that it hasn't, that will make a dramatic impact? What category? Maybe it's broadband or something like that. Why don't we just mix it up and we'll start with Ken.
I think batteries. I think the batteries is the place that we're going to see some really exciting changes that are going to impact our lives throughout. I think about cell phones and how they've changed our lives in so many ways. I think much, much cheaper batteries will change our lives.
Fascinating. It's like The Graduate, the movie. Plastics. Mary Joyce Ivers.
I think it's really looking at our natural resources and how we use what we have, and really like water, wastewater. We're working on a project to recycle our wastewater as for irrigation and such. So with these new technologies coming in, it makes it more exciting. And we're respecting where we live and want to improve it and make advancing the quality of life for all.
From California, where everyone drinks snow melt. Thank you. And Maria, I'm really curious on your front, because you're so involved with students and you have a very active college chapters.
I think in 10 years, with the right investment, I think all the traditional infrastructure is really going to see improvement. I think it's the roads, the bridges, the transit, the airports, water, wastewater. I think some of the stuff that's more behind the scenes, people don't think about inland waterways as much, or maybe dams as levees as much as they should, and there hasn't been as much discussion. But, I think that traditional infrastructure, between the technology disruption that we're seeing and the investment, and with, hopefully a little bit of regulatory relief, I really do feel that we're going to see our grades go up significantly in the next decade.
I'm looking forward to that. And I remember in 2006, I think it was, roughly, the levees broke in New Orleans, and levees became a category for the American Society of Civil Engineering report card. And Mary Joyce, your point, well taken. That's the newest category, I believe. Isn't it, Maria? Stormwater?
Stormwater, right.
And Aaron, you've got the final word, my friend. What do you think is the biggest gain, or the one that might be the most impactful?
I was liking Maria's answer. It's kind of like all of the above. The iPhone, if you think about it, was released in 2007. Kenneth mentioned how that's transformed our lives. That was only 14 years ago. So you're asking us to think 10 years in the future. Well, we talk about how long it takes infrastructure projects to get built, and sometimes they take 10 years to be built. Can we wait 10 years for the next iteration of our infrastructure to be completed? The answer is that the technologies that we pursue and deploy today, they're going to have a direct impact on our world of tomorrow. Right? And those dreams that we have tomorrow can be our reality in 10 years. So how do we take a C- grade and improve it? What would you tell your child, your student? You got to study, right? You need to apply yourself. You got to dive into it. You got to do the homework. You need to engage with the material. What is the art of the possible? Each one of us on this call, and every one of you that's listening, either in real time now or watching the recording later. We ask you, what is it that you can do today to affect our tomorrow? And I guess really, in other words, what is your American dream for our infrastructure?
Aaron Attebery from Black & Veatch, Ken Gillingham from Yale University, Mary Joyce Ivers from American Public Works Association, and Maria Lehman from the American Society of Civil Engineers. What a thrill it is to be talking to you publicly about all these very important matters. And I'm going to turn this over to Eric to conclude our program. Eric?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to our distinguished panel for just what an insightful conversation. I think we could have gone on for 2 or 3 more hours. I know I would have enjoyed it, but I think the conversation is just getting started. So we'll have to do this again someday and track the progress of rebuilding our infrastructure. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. For information about upcoming programs at the Linda Hall Library, visit lindahall.org. While visiting the website, I hope you also take the opportunity to donate to the Linda Hall Library Foundation. Your donations make all of our programs possible, and they help make them freely available. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your evening.
Linda Hall Library is able to offer free programs like the one you enjoyed today because of generous donors. Your support advances the goals to continue expanding programs and educating the world. Please visit lindahall.org/donate.
Good night, everybody.
Right, thank you. Nice